In 74, David, what I remember about Lausanne was this bringing together of word, sign and deed, this more holistic, because the charismatic movement had in some ways been divisive. So can you talk about how significant it was and then to the charismatic movement?
It wasn't an arguing point at Lausanne in the way the social aspect was. But we just had them there. I mean, there were charismatics and there were evangelicals, there were the more traditional churches. We only had a few Roman Catholics, but we did. And that brings me onto the charismatic movement and how it affected New Zealand. It came to us as a movement, I should say, in the early 60s. It really became a force here around the 70 mark. And in my first year, 1965, I got an awful shock at the end of the year. All our students had seemed happy because I'd been happy. And then right at the end of the year, 3 of the men came to me and said, "We're going to leave Bible Training Institute." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because it's not moving with the charismatic movement." And these 3 had come to a real experience. I tried to persuade them to stay, but they didn't. They went elsewhere. But in the 70s, it was becoming a major problem. Not just to Bible college, but churches all over New Zealand were splitting. Not only one denomination either, though it was perhaps most seen in the Baptist, but also in the Brethren, the Presbyterian, and in the Anglican. There were churches that were splitting up because some of the congregation wanted to go with it, go with the flow, and others, it was anathema. It was altogether evil. And it took its main points of uprising were speaking in tongues and healing. And especially, I suppose, speaking in tongues. This became the mark. Well, at the end of 1974, the board got concerned. They said, "We hear there are a number of people speaking in tongues in Bible college, as it by then was. Would you bring us a report?" So I said yes. So on the very first day of 1976, I'm sorry, it's the end of 1975, they asked me to get this report. And the only way to get a report and know what students were doing was to ask them. We just didn't know. I have to say, in fairness, I think we accepted everybody. And the question hardly rose. One of the lecturers was known to have joined the AOG, that's Vic Johnson. But otherwise we were together. However, I gave them this questionnaire. I made it as open as possible to give the students the opportunity to say what they thought and what they'd experienced. And we sent it out on the first day of lectures in 1976 to every student. And every single student replied. Now I challenge anybody to beat that.
That's unusual. Yeah.
Everyone replied. We didn't want their names, but we asked them to give their sex and we asked them to give their marital status and that sort of thing. But what was interesting in it was that even I had thought maybe 20% of our students have spoken in tongues. I know it's more than the board thinks. They only think of the people who are really shouting. We only had a few shouting in tongues. But when I got the answers back and I read them, 40% out of 203, 40% said they had had a previous experience of speaking with tongues. And I was gobsmacked, but you can imagine what others were.
Did you tell the board?
What's that?
Did you tell the board?
And so I told the board, I prepared they'd asked for the report.
Yeah.
So I prepared the report. I gave it to them in March. No, it would have been April. No, that's right. We gave it to them in March. And the board had granted me leave to conduct a world tour, that's got fascinations about it, but I mustn't get onto them. But I had 2 wonderful world tours. And that one, I was going in March for 2 months. So we read the report. And the interesting thing that was that of those 40, we also asked them how they described their own church, their home church. How many came from charismatic churches? Only 16% came from charismatic churches. 84% used various terms, essentially signifying non-charismatic. This means that quite a proportion of our students have had a charismatic type experience, especially speaking in tongues. We did include others, but that was the main centre, which they felt was different from the expectation of their church. And of course, that would have worried the board. However, one question we asked them was if their church didn't agree, were they happy for them still to be in the church and to practice their charismatic beliefs? And there were only 6% who felt that their church was not sympathetic. That's quite remarkable. It's quite remarkable in 1976. And anyhow, we had the meeting of the board in March, and I presented the report, and it was a shocker. And most of the board were at least non-charismatic. I wouldn't say anti-charismatic. Most were non-charismatic. And talk was a bit hot in March. I've always admired Prof. Laidlaw with his wisdom. Prof was, I suppose you'd say, anti-charismatic. But Ted Blakelock said, look, I think the proper thing to do, this is an important question, and the principal's going away on a tour for 2 months. Let's leave this on the table until we have our meeting in July. And if any of you on the board have different opinions from the report, please write personally to the principal. I got 3 letters from the board. All 3 said the same thing. They were all, at least non-charismatic. They were opposed to the charismatic movement. But all 3 said, however, we believe that this is the way the college must go to accept all. So we came to July and we had a unanimity. The board unanimously decided. We had various rules. We wanted the faculty and we wanted the students not to be proselytizing for a particular view in matter of charismania or anything else for that matter. But we were to be open and the staff were to accept people wherever they were. When they had to counsel people, when they had to lecture, they had to give both sides and be willing to meet a student under that student's presuppositions. So it was then moved by one of the board that I should write this in an editorial. This is the editorial.
Which appeared in the Reaper in 76?
August 1976. We published it and I told them everything. Told them just how it had happened, told them what the survey had been, told them what the board's decisions were, and the careful thinking as to how to maintain a unity of peace where there might be this unity.
You were lecturing at the time in New Testament, I presume. But what were your own views about speaking in tongues?
Well, I deliberately tried to maintain neutrality. Privately, I thought, I wonder if the Lord got something for me. And in the years after that, I was often asked, I spoke at a number of conventions all around New Zealand and Australia. And I was going over to a convention in Katoomba, near Sydney, of young people. And I knew a lot of them are going to be charismatic. And I said to the Lord, Lord, am I really prepared? Do you need to give me something that will identify with them? Well, we had a speaker who was a Pentecostal speaker at Bible College, and I asked one of the men who was a leading Anglican man, would he help me? And so we went down the back of Bible College to where there was the lawn by the river in those days.
Down the back of the stadium now, down that way, where the trust stadium is?
Yes,
Yeah.
but more towards Lincoln Road than on that side. And we walked up and down and we talked, and he was a very wise, very helpful man. And he said, look, you just pray quietly and see if anything comes to you. Well, I prayed. And all that ever came to me was either Chinese or Greek. And I thought, that's not an unknown tongue. And I ended up and said, nothing seems to come to me. And he said, I'm not surprised. For a charismatic, that's a pretty big thing to say. He said, but the Lord doesn't give this gift to everybody. And he said, He'll give it to you when and if he wants to, and be satisfied. And I was, and that night, the Pentecostal speaker spoke on a text And I felt it was for me. I was going, I think, the next day to Sydney for this convention. And the text he chose was, "You are complete in Him." And I just felt that was the icing on the cake. And I had some other interesting experiences. I suppose I've experienced most of the charismatic gifts and so on that people speak about, but usually just once or twice, and not in myself, but in my ministry. Quite surprisingly, even falling over in the Spirit, which a number did it for me in Malaysia.
When you were preaching?
When I was preaching. Well, not when I was preaching. It was at the end of the sermon, and both of those two in East Malaysia more especially. And then I think the Lord taught me a lot. Maybe folk who are more academic and who think linguistically aren't quite so dependent on speaking with tongues for the sense of communication with the Lord or communication with other people of God's message. Maybe that's so, I don't know. But I've been content. And as I say, the surprising, some cases of healing.
Can you tell us about some times when you saw healings or experienced that yourself?
Well, I'll tell you one more about speaking with tongues. One of the students who's very close to me, I'd conducted his wedding actually, but he asked could he come and pray with me one day. And I said yes, by all means. And before we started praying, he said, "Will you mind if I, somewhere in my prayer, speak in tongues?" I said, "No, of course not. You're praying to the Lord, not to me." And, well, he did speak in tongues, only a little bit, but he repeated one phrase several times. Now I've got to remember what the phrase was. But anyhow, it was Hebrew. It was obviously Hebrew. And I mean, I'm not Bill Osman. I know my Greek a bit, but I know my Hebrew, don't remember my Hebrew well. But I was sure it was. And he said it several times. And when I went back to my study, I looked up the Cruden's Concordance and found it. And the word, I had prayed that I might understand what the words meant if my student friend was praying. And the word meant, God has heard. It's the name of a minor character. God has heard, and I felt, God's heard me. He told me, don't be afraid. You might not normally understand, but I understand. Perhaps in the case of healing, I was asked to take a service in my own church on healing.
Which church was that?
The Henderson Baptist Church. And I have my own views on healing, actually, rather different both from charismatics and non-charismatics. But anyhow, I spoke on healing, and at the end, one of I think it was the pastor, invited any who wanted prayer to come forward, and the elders would pray, or I would pray. 4 people came up from them, they didn't want the elder, they wanted me. And the results were quite vivid. I can't think of clearly about one, but 3 of them I do. One was a young man who'd been blind from birth. I thought, oh, well, I'll pray. So he came up and I tried to pray with trust in the Lord to do what he wanted to do. But as this young man went back, I heard him mumbling out, "It didn't work. It didn't work. It didn't work." The second man was a man just near the end of his working life, and he worked as a storesman in a company, which meant climbing up ladders and putting things up, and he was finding he couldn't do it. And he asked, would I pray? I prayed, nothing happened. He went and sat down. And then another lady came up, and she had an unusual prayer. She said, I've been to the elders before when you as a group prayed for me, and on that occasion it was praying for my cancer, which she had, and actually 4 days later the oncologists couldn't find any trace of cancer. But she said, I realised that that really wasn't what I wanted to go to the elders for. She said, what I need is my heart. I've got trouble with my heart. I can hardly breathe. I can't walk to church anymore. And she was very close to the church. So I prayed for the man, nothing happened. And I prayed for her, nothing happened. But Tuesday, after the Sunday, the man rang me and said, you know what? I climbed that ladder today, up to the top, and he did so for years. And the next Sunday, I came to church, and as I got there was Agnes, this older lady. She'd only come to the Lord in her 60s, and she was beaming. And I went up to her and I said, you look good today, what's happened? And he said, do you know what's happened? I walked to church today. Well, there are 2. And another one, his leg was lengthened. I didn't see it lengthened, but the pastor said it lengthened by an inch or so. I don't know, but...
Well, just the last question, were the years of charismatic renewal, particularly the 70s, were they were years of change for the college? Were they difficult years for you?
They were, yes. I think the charismatic movement itself had its difficulties. Vic Johnson was the only sort of sworn charismatic, and Vic felt that although it didn't say so in the article, that we didn't want charismatics, and he offered his resignation. Now, I pleaded with him not to. I said, I think we need to have a charismatic voice. And he thought about it for some time, but he did finally resign. Now, that was one point, but there were other points. We were growing in number. We were more diffuse in our thought, and we had a bigger faculty. And so naturally there were strains developing in the 70s and more so in the 80s, not that we were disunited, we worked together. I think we were all happy together. But yes, it did make for difficulties.
Did you stay in touch with Vic after he left?
Oh yes. No, Vic stayed very closely in touch with me.
He died now, Vic Johnson.
Right until his death, and I was at his funeral. Oh no, we remained firm friends. And actually when Vic left us, he went to the AOG college, and I know they got good teaching because he asked me privately, would I mind if he used my notes? And so the AOG college got a regurgitated version of Stewart's notes on especially on exegesis and on ethics. But I know Vic was a very interesting person, a very wholehearted person.
When did Vic die? What year would Vic have died?
It would have been in over 2000 and something, 2000 early years. And Hilda, his wife, died a couple of years later. They were our next door neighbours actually, and I kept in touch with them and their 3 children, one of whom is in ministry now, and another one is a very skilled artist, teacher of art. And anyhow,